Thanks everyone for joining us, and welcome to the 2023 Bibliographical Society of Australia and New Zealand Annual Conference. So I am very pleased today to be introducing Pip Williams. Many of you will be familiar with Pip and her best-selling books, The Dictionary of Lost Words, which was published in 2020, and The Bookbinder of Jericho, which was published earlier this year. I first met Pip when I was asked to chair a Q&A discussion of Pip's work on the Dictionary of Lost Words. With my other hat on, I do book history, but I also do lexicography. So we had a great conversation I think it was a course that was dedicated to the theme of based on a true story. And we engaged with some really fantastic questions and discussion around the research process, as well as the way Pip's creative process works with the research process. And Pip's book, The Dictionary of Lost Words, dealt with many themes around words, the kinds of words that find their way into dictionaries, or at least authoritative dictionaries, and which ones don't, and the gendering of that process, particularly in relation, well, the story, of course, was around the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, but I think it's a theme that continues to speak to the lexicographical process, as I think we talked quite a bit about in that particular session. If you haven't read The Dictionary of Lost Words, I highly recommend it. I know many people who have read it and said very great things about it. It's the story of a young woman who is sort of positioned on the margins of the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary story, but it very much centres her work in capturing these lost words, gendered words that don't make it into the dictionary, class words that don't make it into the dictionary. And it's a really moving story, I think. And I think, am I right, Pip, that an adaptation of this book has been done just recently by the Sydney Theatre Company, and is currently running at the Sydney Opera House, which if you're in Sydney and you haven't bought a ticket, I don't know if there are still tickets available.
It's not. I think they have tickets. It may be available every night, but you have to ring on the day. Yeah.
Okay, right. But yeah, I mean, that must be a real thrill to have your work adapted into a play.
Yeah, so, it is going to Melbourne though, so
okay,
yeah,
great.
so there'll be tickets available in Melbourne. Yeah.
News. So Pip's more recent book is closely connected to the previous one in a variety of ways, some characters that overlap, but it shifts the focus to the story of the bookbinders who worked at Oxford University Press and who bound the Oxford English Dictionary, but also many other important and authoritative works. And I'm sure bookbinding is a theme that very much speaks to our membership, who will include bookbinders. So you might get some tough questions from the bookbinders here in the organisation. But this book too has been hugely popular, and I think, you know, personally, I mean, I've also read it, and it's a lovely way in which it kind of connects back to the original story. But I think the topic will definitely speaks to you know, is close to the hearts of BSANZ folk. So I'm thrilled that Pip will be speaking to us today about her work and her insights into how she transforms her research and her ideas into the finished product of her novels. There'll be a lot of opportunity for questions. So just to explain, there are a couple of different ways in which you can ask questions. You can either raise your hand and I can allow you to talk. You can't show your face, but you can speak. So your question can be transmitted that way. Otherwise, please do put your question into, I think the chat would be more handy than the Q&A, but we'll be keeping an eye on both of those things. So we should have plenty of time for questions. So do think about your questions as Pip is speaking, and I'm sure we'll have a fantastic conversation to follow your presentation, Pip. So thank you very much. So if you want to share screen, and I will turn myself off.
Yeah, I'll share my screen. So, hi everybody. Thank you so much, Amanda, for that lovely introduction. You described my books perfectly, so I feel like I don't need to double up on that. But it's such a pleasure to see you again, Amanda. And we have spoken a couple of times now. And I have to admit, the first time that we spoke, I was quite nervous because, as you know, I'm a novelist. I'm not a lexicographer, and yet I've written about so much of the work that you do and that a lot of the people at this conference do. And so I'm not so nervous anymore, but that's mostly because I completely own the fact that as a novelist, I might get it wrong, but also as a novelist, my job really is to speak to people and get advice from the people who do know what it is I'm trying to write about. And that's one of the things I'll be talking about today. But before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I am coming to everybody from the unceded lands of the Paramount people of the Adelaide Hills. And I also have written much of my work on the lands of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. And I acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging, of course. What I'm going to do today is a relatively short PowerPoint presentation, really, where I will talk about my work, but also often images tell 1,000 words, really. And so I really wanted to show you some of the things that I work with. And while I'm doing that, I'm hoping that you will think of questions. As an author, usually when I am talking about my book, it's in conversation. It's in the conversation that the good questions come out, and I'll be able to talk about the things that interest you the most. So please do think of some questions, and hopefully that will be how we talk most about the book. I'll also be doing a reading at some point, but before I do, I'd like to just reiterate what the theme of the conference is about. So it's the theme of transformation. And I thought what I would do is reflect on the transformative nature of reading and the practical task of transforming history into story and story back into truth. So that's the sort of thing that I'm trying to achieve today. So I'm hoping, here we go. This is my bookshelf, and this is where I'd like to start. These are some of the books that I use to tell the story of my fictional characters in the Bookbinder of Jericho. So the Bookbinder of Jericho is set during the First World War and is about a young woman called Peggy, who works in the bindery of Oxford University Press. She wants to be a scholar, but she is told over and over that her job is to bind the books, not read them. In this story, the books play themselves, and in doing so, they act on my character, Peggy. She reads them and is, in small, incremental ways, transformed. She's transformed by the information they hold, by the ideas they express, and by the emotion they elicit. Most importantly, she is transformed by her deepening understanding that these books, which she loves and covets, are flawed, that the information they hold and the ideas they express are limited to men's experience, and that the emotion they elicit is often manipulative. Fiction, I think, is an attempt to illuminate the particular in order to engage the reader in a new idea, a strong emotion, or a deeper understanding of another's experience. One of the things I love about historical fiction is how it can transform the facts of the past in a way that helps us understand not only the truth of that time, but the truth of our time. The novelist takes these facts, for instance, the dates that battles were fought in World War I, or laws restricting women's participation in work and politics, and perhaps even the content of books that were printed and bound at Oxford University Press between 1914 and 1918. She takes these facts and looks behind them. Her imagination is like a light that shines into the shadowy gaps that always exist in the written and archived history. What I want to talk about today is how I transformed the history that surrounds these books into a story, and how by telling that story, I have explored things that are true. When people read my book, I hope that three things happen. First, I hope they are engaged with the characters and what happens to them. That's my job as a novelist. Second, I hope they gain an appreciation for the work that goes into making a book, to the folding and gathering and sewing of pages, the nipping and trimming and casing in, the finishing and covering and gilding. And I hope the story makes them think more about who gets to make knowledge, who gets to access it, and what is lost when knowledge is denied. Not just 100 years ago, but now. In other words, I want to imagine history into a fictional story that tells more than one truth about the world that was and the world that is. I thought what I'd do before I continue is do a reading from the book. This section of the book isn't what I would normally read, I have to admit, but I thought it is a section that would interest some of the people who are joining us today. So it's not very far in to the book, and my main character, Peggy, she works on the girls' side of the bindery, and that's actually what it was referred to. And the men's side is where she's visiting at the moment. The men's side sounded different, smelled different. The whispering of paper and the constant hum of sewing machines were replaced with the irregular rhythm of guillotines and the mechanical construction of boards. The smells of glue and glare filled the air, a low-tide fishy smell. In the moments it took to adjust, I imagined one of the books that was just then being trimmed or glued or knocked back, being read. Reading was such a quiet activity, and the reader in their parlour or leaning against the trunk of a tree would never imagine all the hands their book had been through, all the folding and cutting and beating it had endured. They would never guess how noisy and smelly the life of that book had been before it was put in their hands. I loved that I knew this, that they didn't. The door to the book repair room was open, and I could see Ebb leaning into his task. I waited, not wanting to cause a slip. The room was small, no machines. He did everything the way it had been done for centuries. There was space for two, and sometimes an apprentice would stand alongside him, or I would be called in from the girls' side to re-sew an old book by hand, like Ma used to do. Ebb could sew as well as any of us, but it was considered women's work by the unions and by most of the men. Today he was alone. The bench was littered with the tools of his trade, bone folders of various shapes for page folding and leatherwork, brushes for glue and glare and gilt, tools for decorating leather and cloth, a gilding cushion, linen, tape and shears. My sewing box was where I'd left it the last time I'd been there. It held needles, thread and cord, a leather thimble and palm shield. Ma had made them for me when I'd begun to sew. There were 3 books on Ebb's bench, likely from a college library or a country home. 2 were in a state of undress, their new casings and red Morocco leather laid neatly beside them. The other was dressed, and Ebb was in the process of finishing. I stood at the open door and watched him wipe a swatch of old leather over his hair, then use it to pick up a leaf of gold. It fluttered as it was lifted by the static, but it kept its shape. He laid it on the newly tooled leather, covering the book in front of him, and I wondered what the title was. He brushed off the excess, then he lifted his thick glasses off his nose and bent close to the book to check for errors. I moved into the room. Will it live to be read another day? He looked up and replaced his glasses. Then he smiled the way he always did when he saw Maud or me. It will, he said. I held up my hand and he placed the book in it. A thin volume, Othello, The Moor of Venice. It's beautiful, Ebb, like new. He ignored the compliment. It's 180 years old. What was the last binding like? He found the scraps of it beside his bench and held them up, crumbling board beneath faded torn cloth. Not the original, he said. That would have been calf or sheepskin, but this lasted about 80 years. Not a bad innings. It was well read. And this will last 100 at least, I said. We'll be dust. He nodded. Don't mind the thought. Being dust, I smiled. Someone from the future holding my book. I like it too, Eb, but I doubt anyone thinks about the people who've bound their books. He shrugged. I don't need them to know who I am. I do, I said. It just came out, and I didn't really understand what it meant. So that's from near the beginning of the book, and it's one of those sections that goes into some detail about the process of binding a book. And throughout the novel, there are sections like that. And of course, I was not a bookbinder. I had never thought about bookbinding until I started writing this story. I'm one of those people in the future who never gave a thought to the people who had brought the book that I was reading into my hand. It's one of the reasons I wanted to write this book. And so how did I do it? So I started with a photograph. Real women in the years soon after World War I, sitting at long benches, folding large sheets of paper into sections, or signatures, as they were also called. These women are working at Oxford University Press on the girls' side of the bindery. Their benches are arranged to catch as much light as possible from the tall windows facing the quad. The light helps them do the job of folding, and they are surrounded by piles of folded sections. There are nearly 40 women in this picture, and the head of almost every one of them is bent to the job. A woman without an apron stands in the centre. She is watching over them, and it is safe to assume, because she is not wearing an apron, that she is a supervisor, ensuring productivity. These are the facts of this image. It is just one image, but it tells so much. I came across this photograph in the archives of Oxford University Press. I was interested in understanding the work of the women who worked in the bindery for a scene I was writing in the Dictionary of Lost Words. I asked the archivist what the archive held, and he brought me this photo. He also brought me a farewell card signed by all the women in the bindery in 1915, and a silent film about the making of a book at Oxford University Press. It wasn't much, and that is the problem with history. For many groups of people, there is little evidence of the lives they lived or the work they did, because it was never considered valuable enough to record or preserve. They were never considered valuable enough to remember. Thank goodness for fiction. Unlike historians, the fiction writer needs very little to weave a story, but if they do it with integrity, I think they can tell a truth just as well. This photograph told me quite a lot about the work of women in the bindery, but it was the film that made me want to write a story. So this is a still from that film, and you can go online and view it yourself if you like. It's quite long. I think it's called something like The Making of a Book at Oxford University Press. It was made in the early 1920s, and it runs for about 18 minutes, but it goes through every single process involved in making a book. In this still, a woman is almost dancing along the length of a bench filled with the sections of a book. She is gathering these sections into her arms with speed and precision, but also rhythm and grace. When she gets to the end, she makes the block of sections square, deposits it, and starts again. When I saw this, I was transfixed, not just by the elegance with which she did her task, but by the book she was gathering. I peered in close to see if I could discern what the book was. I couldn't make it out, and I was frustrated. Then a question popped into my head. I wonder if this woman ever stopped to read the pages she was gathering. Then a second question. If she did stop to read the pages, what would happen? In that moment, I had a character, a woman who wants more than she has, who wants to read the books, not bind them. And that's how most fiction starts, I think, with questions that you want to answer. And most fiction ends, unfortunately, without answers to those questions. Perhaps just more answers, more questions, I mean. So I called my character Peggy, and I gave her an identical twin sister called Maud. I made them live on a narrowboat on the Oxford Canal that was named Calliope after the muse of poetry. I gave them a backstory that would have been true of the woman in that film I just showed you. They went to St. Barnabas, the local school, left when they were 12 years old, and joined the bindery where their mother worked and where their grandmother had worked before her. Their prospects were limited because their gender and their class, and the bindery was likely to be the only job they ever knew. But then the war started and everything changed. There's a reason so many novels are set during wartime. It is a moment of social and political upheaval, when the normal order of things must change and people's lives go in unexpected directions. But the facts of war, as we know them, are weighted towards the experience of the men, and art has followed suit. Novels, poetry, film, and visual art are far more likely to represent the experience of men in war than that of women. When it focuses on women, it is usually on the experience of waiting for a man to come home. The facts of war, as we know them, have left shadowy gaps, and into one of those gaps I have imagined a woman who does not have a husband or lover or brother at the front. Instead, she has a friend, a woman working as a volunteer nurse in France. This friend is called Tilda, and she sends Peggy letters that tell a slightly different story to the one the papers would have Peggy believe. In return, Peggy tells Tilda about the refugees arriving in Oxford. History as we know it tells us about the German invasion of Belgium, the sacking of Louvain, and the burning of the university library. History tells us that men and boys were executed and women were raped. Posters like this tell us that Britain used this atrocity to encourage men to enlist, and the record shows that they signed up in droves. In my story, I take these facts and I weave them with fiction to create a particular story, a story of one or two refugees and the relationships they develop with one or two young women who work in the bindery of Oxford University Press. I do this because it is the particular circumstances of one or two people that will engage a reader. It is wanting to know what happens to these people that keeps a reader turning the pages. As a novelist, I decide what happens. I make it up, but I use history as we know it to help me do this. Ultimately, I want the reader to believe that the story could be true. So in my book, as in real life, 200 Belgian refugees arrive in Oxford in October 1914. They are met by the Belgian Refugee Committee, which included staff and students from Somerville Ladies' College. One of my characters, Gwen, is a student at Somerville Ladies' College. She is Gown, where Peggy is Town, and in normal circumstances they would never interact. But war changes the normal order of things, and they meet as volunteers at one of the many hospitals that are established in Oxford during the war. They become friends, and their friendship creates opportunities for Peggy that she has only dreamed of, but she's dreamed of them a lot. Peggy has always dreamed of being a scholar, and these are pictures of the Bodleian Library. I'm sure some of you have been here, but the picture on your left is the Radcliffe Camera, and the picture on your right is part of Arts End, part of the original library. And some of you may recognise it from Harry Potter. So this is the library that is used in Harry Potter. So Peggy's always dreamed of being a scholar. She wants to read the books, not bind them, but her gender and class make this impossible. Even Gwen, who is a student at Oxford University, needs special permission to use the Bodleian Library because she is a woman. Peggy is a working class woman with no connections to those who might grant permission, cannot access the knowledge held in that place. Though perhaps she can. This is Oxford University Press today. So this is a photo I took on one of my research trips. This is the place where Peggy works. It is also the place that prints and binds all the knowledge produced by the scholars of the university. Peggy is surrounded by that knowledge, and she is thirsty for it, but she is told over and over that her job is to fold the pages, not read them, to gather the sections, not read them, to sew the sections together, not read them. Water, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink, Peggy thinks at one point in the novel. She arrives at work in the morning, and when she leaves at night, Peggy looks across the road at the red brick building of Somerville Ladies' College. She imagines herself in one of the student rooms, looking over Walton Street and back towards the press. So again, this is a photograph that I took when I was in Oxford recently. And on one side, on your right, you can see the side of Oxford University Press. And directly across the road is this gorgeous little red brick building, and that's Somerville College. And so they're directly across the road from each other. And my novel really is a novel about a woman who's trying to cross that road, quite literally. Peggy's story is one of unlikely love, friendship, and ambition. It is completely made up, but I have sewn it into the history of the Great War and the women's suffrage movement in Britain. And I have taken what I know of Oxford University Press and Somerville College and furnished Peggy's story with real people, places, and books. If you want to know how Peggy's story unfolds, you will have to read the book. But as this image indicates, there is one last story of transformation I'd like to tell. And that is how I learned to turn the words I'd written into a physical book, just the way Peggy might have. To tell this story, I have to acknowledge my dear friend, Peter Zajac. Peter is the senior conservator at the State Library of South Australia, and I suspect some of you already know him. He began his working life as an apprentice bookbinder when he was 15, when the State Library of South Australia had more than 50 people working in their bindery, divided coincidentally into a girls' side and a men's side. More than 40 years later, he is the only bookbinder now employed by the State Library. Not, of course, the only bookbinder in the state. There are plenty of bookbinders, but he's the only one left from the bindery at the State Library. Peter helped me understand how books were bound 100 years ago. He read excerpts from my drafts and showed me each process as I wrote about it. And when my own book was printed, he helped me bind it. I'd like to finish this presentation, but not the questions. I'm hoping you're all gathering questions to ask me, because I think the best conversation about books happens as a two-way thing. But I'd like to leave you with a short 3-minute video. It honours the experience and passion of Peter and all of you who work with books and words. Like the work of the women in the bindery who folded the pages and sewed the sections of books, his work is hidden, as your work is often hidden. But my book, The Bookbinder of Jericho, would not be as good if not for Peter. And it may not exist at all if not for the knowledge, expertise, enthusiasm and guidance of an army of librarians and archivists and bookbinders before him. I hope you enjoy the video, and I'll be back with you on the other side. So there you go. That video took about 6 hours to make for just a 3-minute video. And that's because I'm not quite as accomplished as the video might have you believe. Peter had to step in once or twice, particularly when I was trying to bevel the edge of the leather. I'm sure there's some people listening who can do that beautifully, but I think that must take quite some time to master, and I couldn't master it in time for making the video. But in total, Peter has helped me to bind 7 copies of my book. And we had 7 copies because we got them to different stages of production in order to be able to make that video a little bit more quickly. And it was just such a pleasure to learn the processes and to do what it was I was asking my characters to do. So at different times during the writing of this book, which took 3 years, Peter would show me different stages, different parts of the process when I needed to know. But it was just lovely to bring all of that together at the end when my book was published. And now I'd love to hand it over to you. I can keep talking. I've got a pile of books beside me that I could talk about in terms of how I've used them in this story. But I thought I might start with some questions from you. So I will stop sharing my screen now and hand over to Amanda if there's any questions.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Pip. I really loved how your work really brings out the materiality of the book. For book historians, I think this is something that we love to talk about and think about. But I think also what it really made me think about were those people, the sort of hidden labor that we really forget about, that play such an important role in making books. So yeah, it was a really wonderful talk. So thank you. So somebody sent me an email to say that they weren't sure whether or not everyone could get the chat function, but I can say that the Q&A function is working, as is the raise hand. So if you want to either put your question into the Q&A, you can see Q&A at the bottom, should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen, as well as the raise hand function. So we've got a few questions already. So I'll start with one of the Q&A questions. So a question from Juliana, sorry if I mispronounce anybody's name, Juliana Tarascio. I wonder, when you write, do you know the key images, thoughts, insights you wish to create, convey through your works?
Yeah, I actually often start with an image, and so I described the image I started with, which was kind of not an image of my imagination. It was an image from that film that was made in the 1920s, The Making of a Book, of the woman who was dancing along the gathering bench. And that was such a strong image. That's where my idea for the story started. Of course, I hadn't finished writing the Dictionary of Lost Words at that point. So I jotted down that phrase, your job is to bind the books, not read them. And I put it aside, knowing that I would follow it up later for the new book. But that's the image I had in my head, was a woman who essentially was surrounded by the knowledge that she was thirsty for, but she was constantly told she wasn't allowed to access it. And I tried to imagine what that might be like. The second thing I then tend to do, once I've got that image in my head, is I do think of the themes of the book. That comes quite quickly. And the themes of this book were pretty obvious to me from the start. It was about access to knowledge, who gets to access it, but also who gets to make it. This story is about a working class woman who's left school at 12, but she's an avid reader, and she has inherited, this love of books and reading and knowledge from her mother, who also worked at the press. There's, we sometimes misinterpret history and think that people of the early 20th century, late 19th century, working class people were largely illiterate and not interested in reading. In fact, the truth is very different to that. Every Man's Library, which was a sort of series of books that were produced very cheaply, was responding to this working class thirst for reading and knowledge. And working class people did, if they were literate, they read quite a lot. So that was something else that I wanted to explore, was how these people, how working class people who perhaps didn't have the money to access education and books, how they read and how they might have accessed education if they were absolutely desperate to. And that's what this story is about. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I'll ask another question out of the Q&A, and then I'll go to the raised hand. So how long did it take you to bind your book, Pip, and how long would it have taken Peggy? That's a question from Cassie.
That is such a good question. So for me, I was binding a few books at a time, but that's exactly what would have happened in a bindery. So in a bindery, it's a bit like a factory. And I hope I depict it accurately in my book, but you would have a whole lot of women folding the pages that come off the printer, and they would just be folding the same pages actually into sections, and those sections would be gathered up by somebody else and taken to a gathering table, for instance. So just like in a factory, they're doing piecework in many ways. Back in Peggy's day, no one would have bound a book from beginning to end, except maybe the book repairer, who might pull a book apart that was in disrepair and put it back together. But other than that, it would never be done by a single person unless it was at some book of antiquity that was being repaired or prepared specifically for a purpose. But for me, it took several hours over several different days for me to bind just a single book. For me to sew a book took about half an hour for me to sew a book. It would have taken Peggy 5 minutes. And Peter went on his lunch break while and left me to sew one of my books, sew the sections together. And when he came back, I'd forgotten to tie the ends properly, and he made me undo the whole thing and start again, just as if I was a student, or just as if I had just was an apprentice starting in the bindery. So they become very fast at it, but as an amateur I was very slow and I pricked my finger many times.
Thanks. I might just skip ahead actually to a question from Sydney, just because I think that follows on very nicely. So Sydney Shep asks, acknowledging your mentor's role in making the bookbinding process come alive, would you have written anything differently if you had bound the book, practiced your bookbinding before you wrote the novel? And similarly, did you set type before you wrote about it in the dictionary? But would it have been different if you had actually gone through the process first?
You know, I'm not sure I would have written it very differently. I'll introduce you to a book that was really important to me. Some of you might know this book. It's The Art of Bookbinding by, I can't pronounce his name very well. So this is by Zahndorf, Joseph Zahndorf. So some of you might be familiar with this book. This was kind of like the bookbinder's Bible 100 years ago. So this is a second edition, but the second edition is the book that most people used, and it was printed in 1890. And this is the 1890 edition. And it's so, this is so beautifully bound. It's one of the reasons I love it. But it tells me everything about the bookbinding process. And I relied quite heavily on it because this is actually the book that the people in the bindery at Oxford University Press would refer to. What I needed from Peter, I didn't always understand what this book was trying to tell me. And so Peter would translate it to some extent. I also gave Peter the sections that I had written about the bookbinding process, and he would just make sure that I had interpreted the literature or the how-to books, that I'd interpreted them correctly. He also lent me some books that he had on bookbinding and so on. And so I had quite a lot of textual sources I don't know that I would have written anything particularly different because Peter had also shown me those processes, and I'd done them by hand already by the time I bound my own book. So I was really grateful when I did come to the binding of my own book that it felt something like the passages that I had written. That was really important. I would have been devastated if I realized I'd completely, misunderstood something about the process, and it was only in the doing that you understand it. But I had done it a lot in bits and pieces prior to doing my own book.
Thank you. I think the raised hand person has put the question into the chat, into the Q&A. So Deborah Leslie says, thank you for a fascinating talk. You mentioned this several times that Peggy wanted to read the books, not bind them. Is that meant to be a strict dichotomy? Did she not gain any satisfaction from the physical aspect of making books?
Not as much, no. So the story, Peggy has an identical twin sister who likes nothing more than folding the pages in the bindery. In fact, she enjoys folding paper so much that they bring scraps of paper home, and when she gets home to the narrowboat, she folds the paper into beautiful, what we would now call origami sort of paper art. So her sister loves her work in the bindery, but Peggy finds it boring. Peggy finds it repetitive. The joy that she gets is those clandestine moments where she does stop to read the text. And she does this quite frequently, and she gets reprimanded for it quite frequently. She also gets to bring home sections of books or damaged books or poorly bound books that wouldn't be able to be sold. She gets to bring these home, and that's the pleasure that she gets from the press, because suddenly she can bring home a section of a book or an entire book, and she can read it, and she can understand it, and she can argue with it. And this is how she builds essentially her intellectual muscle. She does it quietly through what is discarded from the press. So just like Esme, in a way, in the first novel, who collects words that have been discarded, Peggy is collecting sections of books that can't be sold. And like so many women of their time, the way they access knowledge or the way they access power of any kind is in a clandestine way. They have to do it quietly. Because they're not given these things as a right. And so that's one of the things that I was also interested in exploring in the novel.
Thank you. I'll just read a couple of comments from Karen Attar, a comment and a question. So firstly, she says, thank you so much for the books. I thoroughly enjoyed both of them. One of the things I really liked was the realistic, ambivalent view of the Belgians. But then Karen also asks the question, what gave you the interest in such English topics to begin with? And what will Peggy do after she graduates? Which I think is a question that sort of follows on from what you were just saying about her character, sort of being a bit bored. Well, she is bored by doing
Yeah.
We all want to know what happens to Peggy in the future.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing, so I never really intended to write a book about England. I was just interested initially in the Oxford English Dictionary. And I became interested in the Oxford English Dictionary after reading The Surgeon of Crowthorne, which some of you may have read, which is a non-fiction book. It's very pithy about the relationship between James Murray, who was the editor of the dictionary, and one of the more interesting and prolific volunteers who sent in words with examples of how they'd been used in text on slips of paper. This is how they built their understanding of the words in the dictionary. And at the end of that, the thing that stayed with me was an understanding of how dictionaries were made. I'd never really thought about it. It had never occurred to me that for a word to be in a dictionary, it had to have been written down. Now, that might be okay today because literacy is high, and we also have so many ways of writing down words, and people from all walks of life use those different modes textual communication. But 150 years ago, that wasn't the case. 150 years ago, the 1850s, when the dictionary project started, most of the text that had been published, written down in any way, had been written down by men. And the people who were collating these examples of how words had been used were men. The people deciding on the definition of words were men. This concerned me. And I looked at the dictionaries on my shelf, and I suddenly realized they were gendered projects. Whereas before I'd always thought of them as quite objective, but I realized they couldn't be. And that's what started me investigating whether words might mean different things to men and women, and if they did, whether it mattered that the Oxford English Dictionary, that first edition, whether it mattered that it had been made by men. And so that's where the story starts. And because it was about the Oxford English Dictionary, I just had to go to Oxford. Once I go to Oxford, either on the internet or in person, I realised that there was so many other things happening at the time of the dictionary project, including the women's suffrage movement and World War I. And so that's the story that I wrote. The second book, The Bookbinder of Jericho, really just comes out of the research that I was doing in the archives at Oxford University Press. And sometimes that's how novels get started. You know, just James Murray says this in the preface of one of his dictionaries, you know, one idea leads to another, one thought leads to another, and it's this ongoing process, but there's always these links between the work you do. Some of you are probably academics, and I'm sure that the same thing happens in academia. You study one thing, and in studying that thing, you come across something else that's interesting, and that becomes your next project. In a way, that's what's happened with my novels.
We're not going to speculate on what happens to Peggy.
Oh,
or is that going to...
I do think about it sometimes. I do think about it. It would be a little bit of a spoiler to talk about too much for people who haven't actually read the book. Yeah, I do think about that. I'm not sure.
Well, another question about bookbinding from Danelle McKinley. She says, thanks, Pip. What aspect of hands-on bookbinding surprised you or was the most difficult?
The most difficult was the leather work, and I'm yet to do all my books are bound and covered, and the one thing I've got left to do is the gilding. So Peter is waiting very patiently for me to stop traveling around the country so that I can come back and do a little bit of tooling on the leather and gilding of the leather. And I'm really looking forward to that. But up until this point, the hardest has been the beveling of the edge of the leather. I've found that almost impossible. And he does it so swiftly. I really enjoyed the sewing. I loved using the sewing frame because I think it takes longer. And I used to sew. So I used to sort of be a sewer when I was younger of clothes. But I really enjoyed the process of sewing. And there were so many aspects of it that I liked, but I think the sewing was my favorite. But the thing that surprised me is how long it took me, and Peter saying that in the bindery, you know, the women would probably sew, I don't know, 20 or 30 books a day. And I just didn't know how that would happen. It was taking me so long. So they must become so adept at that aspect of it.
So a comment from Jeff Thompson. I'd just like to say I loved seeing the phrase Mars bone folder in the video. I have one that I use under Adele's supervision, although we sew books as artists rather than bind them. And I remember one of the other events that I was present where you talked about this. There was quite a bit of discussion about the nature of the bone.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. So I've got a bone folder here. And they do come in various sort of shapes and sizes. They don't all have a point on the end. And And what I love about the bone folder is how simple it is, but also how versatile it is. So it's used in so many of the processes of binding a book. So the women, and I say this because I'm reverting back to the way things were set up 100 years ago, but the women would use it to help them make their edges sharp when they were folding. The men would use it in the leatherwork and tooling to make edges, you know, sharp and neat and tidy. It's just such a versatile tool. And apparently I think it's made from calf bone originally, but these days it's often made from resin. So, but yeah, they're beautiful objects. And I think of them a little bit like an axe handle or a wooden spoon that has been in the family for a really long time. That they take on a little bit of the character of the person who uses it, because of course every woman in the bindery would have her own bone folder, and she'd have it for decades and then pass it down to her daughter. And so, you know, they're kind of objects that last.
Lovely. Well, there's two questions here, and I think both of them kind of relate to where you might go in the future. So Karen Florence asks, is your next novel about books? And Sally Bloomfield says, great talk, Pip, thanks so much. Love both your books. Do you think there is enough material around Oxford Uni, the press, or perhaps the Bodleian for a third? So we're trying to find out where you might go next and if it will be related to
So what I can say is I've got a few ideas for future novels, and they tend to compete for my attention. So I'm not quite sure which one I'll settle on next. One of them is absolutely in this same universe, and maybe the Bodleian might have something to do with it. But that one I think is a little bit, that's not my next novel. The novel I'm really writing at the moment, I can't tell you too much about it, except to say that there is a character that walks on the pages of this new novel who has walked on the pages of all of the previous novels. And the thing that I'm interested in actually is art. And if I could just share my screen very quickly, I'll tell you why. When I was doing the research for this novel, sorry, I'm just trying to move it ahead. Okay, so when I was doing the research for this novel, as I've said before, there are huge gaps in the history and in the archives about the lives of working class women during World War I. So what I did was turn to the art that had been made by women at that time. And that included Vera Britton's Testament of Youth, which is this wonderful memoir of World War I, by a woman who, in fact, was a student at Somerville College and then became a VAD in France, and in fact worked on the German ward in France, just like my character Tilda does. And so I got a lot of information from that. Scars Upon My Heart is a book of poetry written by women during World War I that was only collated in the 1990s. And interestingly, nearly 50% of poetry published, or maybe 40% of poetry published during the years of the war, was published by women. But if you look at anthologies of poetry of World War I, most of them have hardly any poetry by women. Some have none at all. And if they do have poetry by women, there's just one or two poems in an entire collection. This is very unrepresentative of the poetry that was published at the time. And it goes to show how women's stories can be in some ways deleted from the history, let alone other people's stories, working class people's stories, immigrant stories, First Nation stories. This is how they are deleted from history. They're just not important enough to keep recording. I read Dorothy L. Sayers' Gaudy Night, which was a novel, but based in her old campus of Somerville College, and Virginia Woolf's War Diaries. The other thing I did, though, was look at visual art made at the time. And the paintings that you can see here are made by a woman called Izzo Ray. She was an Australian artist who was not given the opportunity to be a war artist because she was a woman. So Australia refused women any commissions as war artists during World War I, and only had men. And yet she lived in Etap, which was the biggest army base of the British in France. And she volunteered as a nurse at this camp, which is the same camp that Vera Brittain volunteered at and my character Tilda volunteers at. And in her spare time, she painted what she saw. So even though she wasn't an official war artist, her art tells us a little bit about the experience of war from a woman's perspective. And this is what I used in a way to help me write the story that I wrote. But I have to acknowledge that all of this art is made by middle-class women, women who, as Virginia Woolf would say, had a room of their own and $500 a year. Because working class women didn't have the time or the energy or the money to make art that would be preserved, that would be published or painted on canvas or printed. And so we know less about their lives through their art or their writing, simply because of the type of life they had to live at that time. So my next book, I might be looking a little bit more at the art of women who lived through World War I. Any other questions?
I think that was all the questions in the Q&A. Does anybody have any other questions? We've got, I think, a couple of minutes remaining.
What I thought I might show you, if there's no other questions at the moment, is this image. So my book is all about a young woman who wants desperately to become a scholar. She wants to study at the university she currently works for. But this is a picture of the first women who actually got their degrees from Oxford University. Because at the time of the story that I'm writing, women, even though they can attend Oxford University refused to give them degrees. And that didn't happen until after World War I. And this is a picture of those first women walking in to get their degrees in 1920. And if that is sort of shocking to people, so women had been allowed to study at Oxford University since the 1870s. There had been women's colleges since that time. And they'd been allowed to do the degree coursework, I think I can't remember from when, but for a couple of decades before this. But they weren't allowed to get degrees, even if they came first amongst all the men and women. Cambridge University didn't let women graduate until the 1940s. So it's kind of, it's kind of shocking to realise this. And I just thought you might like to see this. I was saying there's very little evidence of working class women because they don't make art, for instance, and their lives weren't considered important enough to archive. But this is the farewell card I'm talking about. It was actually when Horace Hart, who was the head printer at Oxford University Press, retired in 1915, everyone at the press signed this farewell card. And this is a list of the signatures of the women in the bindery. And I absolutely love this. When I came across it, I think I cried, because here I have evidence of these women for whom there's no other evidence. And these are their signatures, their names in their handwriting. And it was incredibly important. And when I was giving a talk like this once, I got a message from a reader who'd read the book, got to the end, and realized that their grandfather and great aunt had signed this page of the farewell card. They had both been working in the bindery, and she hadn't known anything about them until she read my book and did a little bit of family research, and then realized that her grandfather and his sister had both worked at Oxford University Press, and in fact their signatures are on this page. And it's, it's things like that. We were talking about transforming history, into fiction and back into truth. I think for me that sums it up. I had used this as a little bit of kind of historical research to tell a fictional story, and then a reader reads it and sees their family history in the story and literally at the end of the book. And it was just, it was a really poignant moment for me.